This is a picture from Quantico Marine Base during one of the surveys, and a couple things I'd like to point out to you. One is, as you know, the clutch size varies. In this particular species, typically between 1 and 3. We have documented cases of 5-egg clutches in the bay from the early 1900s. I wrote a paper a year or so ago about a 4-chick brood that was documented on the Delaware Water Gap up in Delaware, New York, a couple of years ago. We've only documented 1 4-chick brood in the bay, and that was in the mid-1980s on the eastern shore of Maryland. Another thing about this particular nest is the green material, and this is something we see flying quite a bit. Raptors are known for nest garnishing. That means they go out and they take green things. Sometimes it's hardwood boughs, sometimes in eagles here in the coastal plain it's typically loblolly boughs, but you can see that here. This looks like cedar or something. Why they do that, we don't know. But raptors have this habit of garnishing, bringing green material in and putting it around the surface of the nest. We don't know what the role of that is in bald eagles. Other species do it much more prominently. Red-shouldered hawks, for example, Cooper's hawks garnish quite lavishly on their nests. Yeah. This is the size of the nest. That's the eggs, which I think you're familiar with. They're about baseball size. You may have seen this image before. But fairly large eggs they produce. The female has to produce a clutch of 2 or 3 in a relatively short period of time. So the female condition is relevant to overall clutch size. They have to be able to motivate this energy in a fairly short period of time to produce these eggs, which are sizable. And here's what you were talking about just a minute ago. And this structure here that you can see this chick hatching in is what we refer to as the egg cup. And it is a built-up portion of the lining which has a pocket in it. The clutch is put in there, and the role of this, other than just containing the eggs, is that it's a sealable place. Okay, the male and female can sit across this, and essentially they can close off a dead pocket of air, which they can heat. Right, so it allows them insulation. They're able to close that off. And as Reese mentioned a few minutes ago, the egg cup doesn't really persist that long. It becomes flattened, so once its usefulness is over, it disappears fairly quickly in the nest, and you've probably seen that on the webcam. Something to mention here is that eagles have 2 different phases of down. This chick here that's just hatched has a coat of what we refer to as natal down, and it's a real spindly type of down. It doesn't have that much insulating capability. And so when they're in this particular stage, they need a lot of brooding and heat from the female or the male. This down stage only lasts 10 days, and we can actually tell this from the air. We refer to these chicks as blondies. We know they're less than 10 days old because that particular coat of down is replaced beginning at about 10 days of age. The last part to be replaced is that on the head, and you may see that in the webcam, is that you'll get these birds that are starting to get gray or brown in the rest of the body, but they tend to still have white on the head. That down on the head is the last track to be replaced. Yeah. And here you can see chicks. These chicks are about 15 days old. This is from a nest up on the Prophet Tank off of York that we worked on a few years ago. But you can see the difference in down. This particular coat of down, which replaced the natal down, does have very good insulating capabilities. And if you've ever handled these chicks, it's just like a sort of down coat. Very insulating there. One of the things that you'll notice through this series of pictures is what you all were just discussing a moment ago, and that is that there is a transition in neural development. In the first 30-some days or so, what you'll notice is that the posture of the birds is sitting back on the elbow like this. They're not very coordinated. The feet develop very quickly. They're one of the first structures to develop, so there's this small bird with big feet. But the other thing is they sit back on their elbows, and as they develop, one of the indicators of age is they make a transition to more of an upright stance, and you'll see that here. This particular chick here is in the late 20s, and you can see it's beginning to grab things, still sitting back on the elbows though, beginning to feather out here. One of the things I want you to notice about this particular nest is this outer rim here of large sticks. And we see that very frequently with eagle nests, and it tends to corral the chicks into the space. Some of these nests, when you go into them, can have a fence around it that's that high off of the surface. And it's built all the way around, and it tends to contain the chicks into the center of the nest. And you can see an example of that here, how high that rim is built up. Yeah. These chicks are more like about in the late 30s, and this is actually at Camp Perry, this nest on the York. You can see that their posture is changing a bit. When those chicks are fuzzy and all, as you know, they're either sleeping or eating all day long. As they get older and older, they're more aware and they're awake more of the time, and they begin to have better neural control. This chick is about 45 days old. It's more upright. And this is really at the point where the chicks, at least in the Chesapeake Bay, reach terminal weight. And so at 45 days of age, they've really reached their maximum weight already. The rest of the development, as Reese was saying earlier, is really spent on neural coordination development. You know, they can move, manipulate things with their feet, they can stand up, move around, they can flap their wings. So a large part of the development period, eagles don't fledge until they're 11 weeks, is really devoted to neural development and coordination control. Yeah. Lastly, I'd like to mention that eagles are large. This is Catherine Markham, who was my graduate student a few years ago, and then another associate here. Eagles are large birds, and there's some consequences of that in terms of their ecology. One is that they need a large platform to raise their chicks. You know, when you consider this as a large bird, they may have broods of 2 to 3, they need a large space to do that. And so these nests oftentimes are large and heavy. You probably can't see this in this light, but there are differences between these two chicks. This is a nest up on the Rappahannock. This happens to be a male here, and this is a female. And you can tell that in development oftentimes, both in terms of the proportions of their structures like their feet, but also in terms of how rapidly they feather out. If you can see this better, you can see that this bird is completely feathered out. This one is not. It still has down showing through. And that's because females are larger, it takes them longer to reach their terminal weight. And so the energy that's coming into them is going into growth. Because males have a smaller terminal size, they're able to divert that energy into feather growth at a much younger age. And so oftentimes you go into these nests, they're the same age, but one of them looks like it's at a younger stage. And that's the difference between sexes in terms of how they develop and how they're able to allocate energy to different parts of development. So here's a couple of nests just to show you what the sizes are like. This is Catherine, this is myself there. Catherine was a graduate student of mine in the early 2000s, and she was looking at growth rates of chicks. And so we climbed a lot of nests. We put video cameras in nests to look at prey delivery rates and those types of things. She's now a PhD student at Princeton working with baboons in Kenya. She's gone down. Because of the size of these nests might weigh a ton or so. I've come into some of these nests that might be 8 feet deep. You know, you come up to the nest and then, you know, you're standing at the bottom of it and the top of it's up here. They're large. They require large specimen trees to support them. And that's something that in some parts of the lower bay is in limited supply. Most of the trees that they're using in the bay now were planted sort of prior to or around the period of the Civil War. You know, those of us in this generation sort of don't recognize what the landscape was like at the time of the Civil War. It was completely denuded. We had almost no trees left. And because eagles require very large specimen trees that are of that age, most of the trees that they're using are from that era. I don't know whether you can see this, but this is me on the tree right here. This is only about half of this tree. It's a large tree. That nest there is about 8 feet across at the surface. I could lay down on that nest and not hang over the sides of it. I don't know whether you can see me here. That's me there. That's Dana Bradshaw holding the climbing line at the bottom of that. So these are large trees that they require. These nests are the size oftentimes of Volkswagens, and they need a large structure to support that. Here's another characteristic of their nest trees. Here's a nest up on the Rappahannock, and it's sort of isolated out in the marsh. And what I want to point out to you is the space around that. It's what we refer to as crown access. Eagles are large birds. They have a difficult time flying through small spaces, so they tend to choose trees that are isolated so they can fly in and out of the nest unobstructed. I'll show you another picture of that. This is a nest that's been active for decades over in Isle of Wight County in a pasture. It's right here, and you can see it's in a scattered situation where there's a lot of space to fly through. That seems to be an important characteristic for eagles because of their body size. So there is quite a bit of their ecology that sort of centers around this body size problem. And I want to give you an indication of a territory. So these are different nests. This is a 40-year history of a territory of a pair up on the Potomac River. Does anybody know of the novelist John Dos Passos? He's an American novelist, famous American novelist. This is his property. He died in the 60s, but his family still owns this property. He was a lover of eagles, and he has protected this property for this pair. He used to live right here in this house. His daughter now owns the property, and she's taken out an easement to protect this site. But what I want to point out here is that, as you know from this particular pair here at the gardens, these birds move around a considerable amount, so they actually need more space than the nest itself. And they tend to require, if you look at the distribution of these nests, they tend to require a space of about 70 hectares to 100 hectares. So that is, 150 acres or so of space in order to move around over a long period of time. These territories tend to be focused on a drainage like this, and that is a movement corridor between the foraging area out here on the shoreline of Potomac and the nest structure itself. So they tend to fly in and out in particular areas and access the nest that way. So what is it that causes them to change nest structures? There's a couple of things that we see that are dominant here. This is Mitchell Bird here inspecting a nest that's blown down. This particular nest tree was on Plum Point up near West Point, and it had died due to a lightning strike in the previous year. The bird was incubating in the first flight that we made, and then a storm came through and it snapped this tree off. So we went in there to find the nest egg remnants, and Mitchell was digging through there to look for the egg fragments. But that's one thing that happens, is that because these are large isolated trees, they're susceptible to wind throw and lightning strike, which kills them. And so they may only last for a couple years after they're dead, and then the pair needs to move on to another nest tree. Another thing that we see quite a bit is nests being taken over from raccoons. This is Catherine here. There were eggs in that nest a couple days previous. We went over there to climb to put a camera in. She got up right to the base of the nest, and I don't know if you can see that, but there's a raccoon that came out of the nest and met her there. Neither one of them knew what to do. Eventually what happened was that raccoon jumped over Catherine and then came down the rest of the tree. But we see that quite a bit. In a fairly small portion of the nest, maybe 5% a year, are taken over by raccoons. What they do is to burrow down into the center of it and make their own nest within the nest structure. And oftentimes we'll fly over and they'll look up out of the hole at the plane. But it's one of the sources of nest loss. The other one is great horned owls. Great horned owls take over about 3 to 5% of the nests every year. And everybody asks, how is it that an owl is able to take over an eagle nest? Great horned owls at this latitude have a very early breeding season, actually earlier than many of our eagles. And they seem to be able, they don't build their own nests, as you might know, so they take over nests of other species or use old nests, and they seem to be able to take over nests, at least from some eagle pairs. It's probably young pairs that they're taking nests from.